on the ballot directly. So coming out of 2016, November 9th, I ate a lot of Shake Shack, but a lot of other people were looking at kind of what went wrong. The biggest thing that stood out, I think, to my bosses and donors that funded our organization was how big of a gap there was between digital investments between Democrats and Republicans. And everyone was kind of asking, how do we solve that? Why is it happening? What do we need to do to fix this problem? So I think this chart demonstrates a teaser, which is that the gap has certainly closed between Democrats and Republicans online, but the Republicans are still ahead of us. And so Priorities decided to keep its doors open for the 2018 cycle. And our goal as an organization was kind of to accomplish two things. One, we're going to invest $50 million online to close the gap up and down the ballot. And also, secondarily, which as Steve pointed out, I'm going to talk a lot about today, we didn't want to just close the gap ourselves. We wanted to diagnose it, figure out what was going on and why Democrats were underinvesting online. So we have a whole, we had a whole secondary goal to kind of answer that question. So I'm going to talk through the three biggest lessons that we learned in kind of running that entire endeavor. The lessons break down between creative, media buying and budgeting, and then talent and staff. I'm going to spend some time on each of those as separate categories. So actually, I'm going to start with creative. So I think the biggest lesson that we learned when it comes to creative development and creative production is that creative testing, when it comes to persuasion, is a requirement. It's not something that you can just choose to do willy-nilly. It definitely impacts the effectiveness of the program, and it's something that we are going to continue to do moving forward for nearly every single piece of creative that we put out. And reason being is that I'm going to talk through three goals. What works in a poll is not going to necessarily work in execution and how people see things in the real world. There's an incredible amount of ROI, and we don't think that there's a silver bullet rule of thumb that we can follow that allows us to kind of understand what creative is going to work, so we have to do it every single time. So to spend some time on each of these, I think as a group of political hacks, we've gotten really good at constructing polls to say what we want them to say, but also in a way that doesn't necessarily reflect how these messages are going to be communicated when people actually see them in the real world. So not only are we constructing polls that don't necessarily service digital mediums, these message batteries are incredibly long. They don't fit into tweets, they don't fit into search ads, they don't fit into 15-second spots. It's hurting digital more than it's hurting other mediums. We also are testing our messages very separately than how these messages are actually going to be deployed. When we ask about sex trafficking in a poll, maybe we're going to get a really good response, but then when you get someone to actually speak to camera about the same issue, how they come across, their tone, and how you actually construct that video is going to be very different. And so I think not only are we finding that polling needs to be adjusted to better reflect digital needs, we also need to add a second step, right? We need to actually produce concepts that we think are going to work in the real world. We need to test how they perform before we can move forward. So this is just an example. Sex trafficking in Missouri raised doubts. We put together ads. Didn't necessarily actually work when we put them into banner ads or into 15s. So I think can talk more, if helpful, about the different tools that we use to test these creatives, but I think we often, we leaned on panels a lot and didn't necessarily do a ton of in-field testing, but did a lot of it in panel environments, which was really helpful for us. Second kind of learned is that testing has an incredible amount of ROI. I think thinking a lot about the goals of testing and what are we trying to get out of it, I think I kind of have the mindset that creative testing is supposed to help us kind of eliminate ads that are going to do harm. We're testing creative before we put it out there to make sure that we're not going to do more harm than good amongst the voters that we're talking to. And that's definitely happening, right? Like I think with our mobilization ads, we saw that 21% of the ads that we tested didn't have any effect or did harm, and same thing, but 32% for all of our persuasion assets. So we're definitely using this step to eliminate assets that are going to move voters the wrong way, but we have the added benefit of picking ads that are better than the average ad. So we're actually, by testing our creative before we put it out there, we're letting our dollars go further as far as the impact that they're able to have by serving better creative. So I think this is really important because I didn't talk about this at the beginning, but we had a really robust and diverse creative team that we recruited from not just Political World, from a bunch of different places, and we encouraged them to put out creative content that was creative and not kind of the traditional political content. And so in order to kind of let our creative team have the most flexibility, we also needed to have a step in that process where we could test that creative to make sure it was actually communicating what we wanted it to communicate. Because I think the most important rule here is that there, like I said, there isn't a silver bullet best practice when it comes to creative. I think we've got, I know the Hub did some research on this, that storytelling is a really good way to communicate a message, but that's very broad, and I think there's no like, oh, getting someone to speak to camera directly when then they cry and tell an emotional story is the best way to communicate. Like, there's no rule of thumb like that. So the best way to kind of understand if an ad's gonna work is to produce an ad and then test it. So we saw a lot of experimental content, which is just a fancy way of saying we tried new things, that worked and moved two-way support, but then we also have some examples of content that didn't work. One of the things I'm really excited to do next cycle is to kind of gauge how humans are able to kind of predict these results. We didn't do this last cycle, but we kind of want to understand, like, going into a test, what do I think is going to do well? Like, do I have the ability to guess and gauge what's going to work? And then use that as a data point to kind of better reflect if we're right and what percentage of the time we are right. I don't think we're going to be right a lot of the time. I think we are not the voters that we're speaking to, and we're not super good at predicting. So that's why we have to lean on testing. We saw the same thing for GeoTV, which was helpful. One thing I think for GeoTV that I personally think is really important and is going to guide our principle moving forward for priorities is our GeoTV creative was all led and produced by a Black woman. And I think it showed, because our creative that we tested for GeoTV, a lot of it did better in testing because we were speaking to the voters who looked like us. And I think that is really important, that we continue to staff our creative department with, and all of our departments, frankly, with people that look like Americans. So the lesson is that make good experimental content, but test it, because you never know what's going to work and what's not. And if helpful, during questions, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the tools that we used and kind of best practices for how we went about testing and measuring, because I think that's a really important part of this equation, because I think it also needs to scale. We're a very different organization with different production needs than a lot of smaller campaigns, but I think there are solutions. Cool, so the next thing I want to spend time on is budgeting. This is my favorite topic, so I could spend an entire hour on this, but I'm not going to. So one of the things that I want to talk about is my least favorite question, which I'm going to skip this, is what percentage of my paid media should be digital? Raise your hand if you get asked this a lot. Okay, yeah, it's a stupid question. I hate it. Let me see if my animation works. Okay, so feel really strongly that you should not be basing your digital budget based on a percentage of your overall paid media budget, but instead you should be kind of identifying what you think your digital program should look like based on reach, frequency, audience, and then taking a look at the market that you're in and figuring out what makes sense accordingly. So we, I think, in the beginning of the cycle, had a question that we wanted to answer before kind of going any further with budgeting, which was, are there people or voters who are more online or not online that we should consider not budgeting for, or under budgeting for, or over budgeting for? And so we ran a really cool test in the beginning of the year. We picked out some messages that were persuadable, or were good persuasion messages, but not necessarily in the news. And then we used those ads to measure recall, to understand whether or not there was a difference in recall between different audiences. And we ultimately found a very, very simple takeaway, but one that I think is helpful to have backed up with data, which is that everyone is online. And I know that sounds silly, but I think we just need to keep repeating it, which is that every single voter is reachable online, and there's not like a voter that you're going to miss out on, which is very different than other mediums. So it really gives us some flexibility when it comes to budgeting. This is an example of distribution of impressions. I think this is Arizona. It just shows that, I think, back in 2012 and 2016, I think we would often get asked, well, what about old people? They're not online. Well, they are. They're probably online less, and therefore you can't build as high of a frequency, but they're definitely still reachable, which I think is helpful to have data that backs that up. With that said, I think the way that we typically went about doing media allocations, it's kind of, even with a digital-only program, which is obviously what we did, we still used TV market efficiency to guide our digital budgeting. Taking a look at TV in terms of who is not watching TV, and then giving them a healthier dose of digital frequency. That's kind of bullet number one, mirroring consumption. We know that that number is changing every single day, so we should be keeping a close eye on it to identify who are the cord cutters, who are the people who are watching less TV, what is their TV behavior, how should we be changing our budget allocations accordingly. And then two, and the one that I think we probably used a little bit more this cycle, was how does the efficiency of an individual television DMA change how we should be thinking about allocation. LA DMA, I think there were 6 congressional districts in the LA DMA. That should change your allocation to digital accordingly. Same thing with expensive television markets like Miami, where you can probably go further with your dollar using digital than other mediums. And that is budgeting. The final topic that I want to spend some time on is staff and how do we scale all of this? Because I think we had a 60-person digital team, and we're fortunate enough to have a lot of resources dedicated to digital, but I think we also want to make sure, like the secondary goal I laid out at the beginning, we want to make sure that we're not the only ones spending and that we can teach other people how to do this appropriately. So digital marketing is complicated. It is not straightforward. It is, I don't want to say it's easy, because it's certainly not, and I have built my career on being good at answering questions about it, which has certainly benefited me, but I don't want that to be the norm. So I think looking at the political ecosystem especially, it's difficult to navigate. Like, I think if you look at the different advertising options that we have, Pinterest was like, nah, I don't want to do political ads. But then I think they changed their mind at the last minute, and they did let you do political ads if it was mobilization. Facebook, who even knows, honestly. We can skip them. Amazon, I think, is still saying no to political ads, but like, who knows where their head is at. Google randomly decided not to let us run ads in Nevada. It's just a lot to keep up with, and it's not straightforward. I like to say that television is a mounted device on a wall. Digital is way more than that, which I think, I will go to my next slide, that is not a curse, but it is a blessing if we look at it that way. So I think digital has the ability to solve a lot of different goals that a lot of other mediums can't solve, and if we see it that way, that's when we get to awesome kick-ass media plans. Digital allows us to reach people where they are at every point in the day. This creates complicated media plans that are time-consuming to execute. I think we've all been in a situation where you're told that a media plan isn't going to be ready for a week. That's frustrating, but it's real. And then targeting. There's a lot of different options for targeting, but some of these options aren't scalable across every single platform. Like, you love Hulu because it looks like television, but you also love lookalike targeting, but Hulu doesn't do lookalike targeting. It's a confusing map to navigate. But if we view it as a luxury, and we can see the value of search as a very unique platform for attracting voters and changing their mind, it can solve a lot of problems as long as we see it that way. But all of this is to say that it requires a lot of staff, talent, and time. I know at the beginning of this cycle in 2017, my boss was kind of asking me, how do you think we should do this? Should we build capacity in-house? We didn't do that last cycle. It was a really, really hard question to answer for me because I really wanted to build capacity in-house, but I also felt really strongly like I had come from an agency background and kind of saw the struggles of what it means to retain talent, to grow talent at an agency, and felt that given the quick turnaround, and we were gearing up to spend money in Virginia and Alabama, I didn't feel strongly that we were going to be able to actually build a diverse and well-managed team. Also because the talent didn't exist, and I felt like we would have to do a lot of training in order to get there. And so instead of building an in-house team at the summer of last year, we decided to build a training program instead, and to kind of build for this cycle, frankly. And I'm really glad we did that, because I think now we have a lot more flexibility to build more capacity in-house, because we had 8 awesome fellows that now know a lot more about digital advertising. Anyway, all that to say that we ran a program that it's my favorite program that we ran, honestly. We wanted to kind of understand if we could run a simpler media plan and still cause a similar impact. I think I was getting a lot of questions about if I just run Facebook ads, is that enough? Like, is that, because obviously, like, teaching someone how to launch Facebook ads is a little bit more straightforward. It's one platform. But I was kind of like, man, like, that's like muted video, and I don't think that's going to do enough. Like, I don't think we should be preaching that you can just get away with Facebook. And so I didn't feel confident answering that question, and wanted some data to back it up. So what we did is we took 2 of our fellows, Charlotte and Soraya. They're great, follow them on Twitter. And we gave them $100,000 and 2 congressional districts that were less competitive. We trained them. I think the middle little image here is the most important. We took, I don't know how many, 4 months, I want to say. We embedded them fully with our team. They were in comms, they were in analytics, they were in design. We taught them kind of the full lens of what it means to run a digital program, a media program. And then we gave them tools to produce creative, we gave them polling, and we let them design a program start to finish. They put together a media plan that was primarily Facebook and Google, actually I think entirely Facebook and Google. And then we held out half the district and didn't serve ads to half the district using individual targeting. We found, based on initial results, and Nick is in the back and can correct me if this is wrong, but we think we moved about a point. We're gonna get full voter file results back that will confirm that, and I think make it higher, potentially. Yeah? Yeah? Okay, thumbs up. And so we're really excited about this, right? Because it's like you can train new staff, similar to how you would train a field organizer, on how to think about digital as a communication method. And you can move people similarly to how you would move with a mail piece. And you can do it, and you're probably moving different people than you're moving with mail. I don't have a way to back that up, but I think it's true. And you can do it, I hope it's a model that campaigns will adopt, because I think it allows us to scale a lot more than we currently are. So I love this experiment. I think we want to do more of this moving forward. I know that doing things is the best way to learn. I know, like back in 2012, Shannon is in the audience. The best way that I learned how to like launch media plans was, it was like, it's crazy that I'm even saying this, but like we had a last minute push in Colorado for voter or ballot return, and they were like, Shannon was like, hey, here's $200,000, like put together a media plan. And I was like, all right. And like that was the best way that I was able to actually like learn how to do it, was I like dove in. So we took a risk, we gave these folks money, and I think the result is really encouraging. That is my presentation. Those are the 3 biggest lessons that we learned. So I'm happy to answer questions.
Over there. I'll get there eventually. Yeah, but you know, it's for the folks at home, hey? Just remind us who you are, where you work, please. Thanks.
Hi, Chris Winburn, I work at Flash Talking. We're a creative personalization service, so it's very interesting in the first section of your presentation. You talked about tools and measurement metrics, and that was kind of in the back of my mind throughout, and I was like, oh, I hope she talks about that. So I wanted to ask and see if you could share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, of course. Sorry I didn't touch on that. So I think the metric when it comes to measuring success of these programs, everything here I talked about was digital persuasion. I didn't really touch on mobilization, and we didn't do any direct response or anything like that. So the ultimate metric that we are using is, did you change someone's mind? We typically would use like horse race, favorability, survey questions, amongst a lot of others. But I think that measurement objective makes all of our lives more challenging, right? Because it's not like we can use a conversion metric to measure success or failure. And so a lot of our creative testing for that reason was done not in field. It's not like we would serve ads and then measure the impact of those ads in the real world. We would often use panels to put creative in front of someone and then ask them questions about that creative, which I'm not suggesting that that's the perfect method. I think how someone views a creative in a panel environment is fundamentally different than how they're gonna see it in their Facebook feed. We're working on some validation practices that help us kind of understand whether or not the panel testing is validated in field. We have some initial evidence that suggests that we think it's getting us the same results. But to answer your question broadly, I think we were using surveys. Where did you go?
Amy Stern, Brave Now PR. I had a question about your fellows. Where did you find them? How did you pay them? How long were they employed for? I mean, give me some advice on how to do it.
Yeah, good question. So I think timeline I'll start with. I think you need at least 3 months to train someone on the fundamentals of marketing. I think that's when you hit 3 months, I think that's when you like hit the sweet spot of like, okay, I'm starting to get it. I start to understand the difference between persuasion and direct response. So I think we started to bring folks on over the summer. As far as recruitment is concerned, I think a huge part of our fellows program was to continue to build a diverse talent pool, and the Democratic Party puts a lot of thought into that. And so I think we tried to recruit locally. I think from Jen, who's our deputy ED, is a graduate of Howard. I think we tapped into that network. I think there's a lot of we recruit a lot of people from from GW, but I think we need to expand that. No hating on GW, but there's just a lot of folks from there. I think that answers your question though. We paid them the same as our entry level salary. They were fellows for 3 months, I want to say, before so essentially we brought the fellows in. They did like a week or so at a time with each team. So the teams were like design, video, writing, analytics, comms, research, media. I think I'm getting all of them. So they did like a week at a time with each of those, and then they were given a placement. The placement was the final 10 weeks, I want to say. And so the two fellows that were placed on the self-serve experiment, that was their placement. But we had other folks embedded with analytics, with media, with creative. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. I appreciated some of your hot takes on different ad platforms. I was curious, following up on that, were there any particular placements that kind of went up in your esteem maybe over the last cycle or two, or went down over the last cycle or two in terms of when you're thinking of media planning, just immediately like, hey, percentage-wise, we want to put more here or less here? How did that shift over the last 2 to 4 years?
Yeah, really good question. I have so many thoughts. My team's going to laugh, but I've fucking obsessed with search. I think we underutilize it so much. To me, Google has done a really good job, I think, since 2012, of like innovating alongside political campaigns to kind of get us what we need as far as targeting options and approvals. And the Google team is really kick-ass, and I'm really love working with them. The only other addition I would make is I think we're missing the mark, I'd say, on audio. That's going to continue to just change as we all have Alexas and Google Homes. Like, I think we're going to need to think fundamentally differently about how we do audio creative. Yeah, really good question. So we had a whole coordination department last cycle that was in charge of not only just doing this, but talking about it to other organizations. We had partners Pamela's in the audience, she's going to be on the next panel. It's our biggest partner at S&P. We had a lot of healthy partnerships with other organizations. I think moving forward, Priorities just announced yesterday that we're adding a political department to kind of help continue to facilitate those partnerships moving forward. But we see that it can't just be us. We have to talk about it too. Good question again. I'm hopeful that we will be able to do a lot more of the buying in-house next cycle just because we have a larger roadmap. We know kind of 2 years out what we think we're going to do. Maddie Krieger is in the audience. She's been tasked with putting together plans on how we would actually put together an in-house buying operation, but we're not making any decisions right now. We want to make sure we're working with data before we make any sort of calls on that.
All digital marketing. ID files, of course, is sort of the lifeblood of all this, but then the question becomes, how are you appending this? How are you reading and making best use of those profiles? How are they being used in targeting and ultimately in attribution? To talk about the ways in which data has evolved in this cycle and how it's being used, we have a panel led by Sue Zoldak, who is the founder of the Zoldak Agency. She has worked in both consumer and political marketing, is also leads the networking group DC Media Peeps. Zoldak Agency was named Public Affairs Firm of the Year in this year at the Reed Awards. Please welcome Sue Zoldak on our panel.
Are these already on? Oh, okay. I love this panel, you guys. Everyone dinged in at exactly 1:00:00 when we did our prep call. I'm still getting over we found 2 fellows and we gave them a $100,000 phrase. So I'm a little. I didn't hear a single word past that. I was so impressed. All right, on this panel, you guys, we have to my immediate left, we have Ben, who just this past cycle was the Chief Digital Officer at the Republican Governors Association. Prior to that, he has served roles including at the Creative Artists Agency, at Google, at Unilever, as well as Romney for President at the the Republican National Convention, the National Republican Senatorial Committee, and of course, as I just mentioned, at the RGA. He has directed over $100 million in targeted digital advertising. In the middle, we have Pamela, who is the Senate Majority PAC's first ever digital director. Prior to that, she worked at a top New York State political firm where she was named one of New York City's 40 under 40 rising stars by City and State in 2016. And at the end of the panel here, last but not least, we have Phil, who is a senior vice president at Push Digital. He leads digital strategy, or has led digital strategy for Marco Rubio's 2016 re-election campaign. He has directed online fundraising for South Carolina's Congressman Trey Gowdy. Prior to joining Push Digital in 2016, served as vice president of digital at Stone Ridge Group, and founded Brushfire Digital, a digital consultancy for Republican candidates and committees. So I want to start off. Gosh, there's so much to cover in our data panel here, but one of my favorite subjects, as you guys know. So in our session description, I'll start there, and then we can veer wherever you guys want to go here. In our session description, it says, how have campaigns involved their harvesting of voter data to ensure a richer and more relevant set of data points? So I take that to interpret that to mean kind of how did it go? What were the main lessons that we took from the last cycle in terms of using that voter data and or making it richer and more relevant. So who would like to start with talking about that wonderful voter data?
Go for it.
I'll start just position-wise. Well, on the Republican side of the aisle, for almost any Republican campaign or committee organization, there's a heavy reliance on the two major players in our space, which are i360 and Data Trust. And I think over the years, there's a point where there's always a narrative in the media, who's ahead or behind on data, who's ahead or behind on digital. And I think right now, the Republican Party and entities operating within Republican campaign space feel pretty good about where we are, because I think the competition between i360 and Data Trust have really turned them both into significantly better operations year over year and cycle over cycle. And the re-elect is definitely encouraging all the Republican campaigns and committees that they speak to double down on using Data Trust to ensure that as much information is coming into that overall pool from elections, local and from small, statewide, across the country. So those firms, as they continue to bring in more people, get better and more experienced folks, right now I think as a political organization we feel really good about the quality of data they're able to bring in, both off the voter file as well as layering in consumer data and working with teams internally to constantly find new ways to bring in new information about potential voters to really create like a really deep, rich understanding of who we're trying to reach.
So I will say this cycle, I think we actually, there was never a single campaign or race that we worked on that we didn't use. We used more than one data set every single time. Our approach was never singular. It always involved sort of varying data sets and varying sort of universes. And so really when we were thinking about what we were going to use and how we were going to use it, from the voter file to zip codes to in-platform data, it was really about thinking about the universe that we were talking to and what made the most sense, then also about layering. So when we know that there are traps with certain data sets, we were able to sort of fill those or expand on them using other sort of targeting methods. So our approach was very holistic in that sense, and I feel pretty proud about the work that we did in that regard.
I'd have to say, for me, the biggest thing that happened this cycle was the reliability of data that was obtained from modeling became incredibly reliable. I think my best example this cycle was suburban women, GOP women who were pro-Second Amendment, but also pro-assault weapons ban. From a messaging standpoint, that is a minefield, and if you get it wrong, you're in a world of pain. And having just reliable models this cycle that were really effective and that were able to help us drill down on those targets was just, for me, really cool. Seeing those go from a target universe into a turnout universe, and seeing your message work and feeling good about these expensive models. I think for me this cycle, that's what happened.
So that took us like 90 seconds to get from the voter file to the modeling data. How fast in each of your campaigns did you kind of, let's talk about that, because we hear that question a lot, where especially in political clients come or campaigns come and they think the voter file is like the end all be all. But then very quickly as digital strategists, we say, you know what, it's not the voter file that is the key here, it's this consumer file, the native file, the modeling data. How quickly in your campaigns do you feel like you turn sometimes towards that almost entirely?
Well, I think, and Ben could probably elaborate on this too, on the Republican side, with the organizations that we work with, the voter file is kind of like the foundational piece of that data set. So no matter what, you're touching the voter file. But it's all the different layers, whether it's modeling or just the data points that have flowed in, have kind of made the data. There are greater indicators in the data than just somebody's voter ID or their voter history nowadays, in some cases. Some cases, those are still the things you're looking for, but the availability of data laid on top of that voter file has kind of changed the game in the last several cycles.
Yeah, I would just say that I think building out those models, which is looking at the voter file as a base layer and then understanding how we think people are actually going to behave, was a starting point for our organization, and I think most of the major organizations, at the very beginning of the cycle, and trying to look at the most recent lessons. So for example, with the Republican Governors Association, trying to look at the elections in 2017. We had 2 governors' races in 2017 that we were paying a lot of attention to and working with, and then looking at the results, seeing how maybe the turnout actually differed from a lot of the polling, and maybe differed from our internal models, if it did, and then going into the beginning of 2018 with polling focus groups, looking at the results there, and working very, very closely with external data partners and data scientists to be able to understand what were we accurate about looking at 2017, what were we wrong about in 2017, and knowing that there's a really major election, or there's going to be 36 governors' elections in 2018, how do we make sure that we are being properly informed to get things right where we got them right and get them right where we got them wrong just a year ago. So, and that's really, really the starting point when we look to figure out how we're going to allocate funds for the rest of the year.
So, as we know, the voter file and the modeling data and the programmatic data does talk to each other relatively well. And then there are what we call, or I guess in the session description, walled gardens. So let's talk a little bit about that. Does that exist, or where do you find that there are so-called walled gardens, or where does the data not talk over well, or where do you find frustrations where you don't feel like the data works, and that could be across a certain platform or across a party? Like, where is the data not going where you want it to go?
So to speak very briefly about the voter file and the modeling, I would say we certainly use that as a baseline, and then sort of built our way up from that. And I think part of that, part of the conversation that we were having this cycle that speaks to sort of the walled garden issue, which I think is increasingly going to become problematic as we're seeing more regulations and more players come in. We're looking like, I think NBCU just announced today that they're going to run a new streaming service. And so, the data becomes increasingly protected. And so the conversation that I think, we're starting to have and need to continue to have is, how do we work across these walled gardens? How do we track people across these walled gardens? And then also, how do we weight these different data sets? So like, how are we weighting, the voter file to the modeling, to zip codes, and to other forms to make a good decision about who we're talking to and how we're talking to them?
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of specific media placements, there are walled gardens, for example, with Google reservation buys, which we found were pretty efficient. They're force view, sound on. It's force view. You can't bring your own data. By that, you can't just send them a list of voters. In most of the cases when we're saying data, we mean like a list of voters. So we can't send them a list of voters and say, we want to hit these people. You can use that for other tools within their portfolio, but not for that. Or with Hulu, for example, you can't send them a list of voters, but that's force view, audio on, in some cases, full television size inventory, so it's very high quality. So, I mean, in those cases, you have a list of voters. Just because you can't upload that list of voters doesn't mean you can't break that list of voters down by where they fit in within certain zip codes. Do they more heavily skew male versus female? Some of these platforms maybe you can target by household income, or you can target by age. So there's a number of different ways where you just, by understanding what that actually voter list looks like, you can find the most effective kind of counterpart within the types of targeting that system does allow. And so all systems are going to allow you to do geo-targeting down to a zip code. They're all going to allow you to do different variations of age targeting, of gender targeting. So in cases where we really want to have a similar approach across a number of different walled gardens where we couldn't bring our own voter list, we would try to find those similar kind of universal targeting options that we felt most closely corresponded with that actually voter list that we cared about.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I'm not a magician, so I can only do what I can do. The I'm not there to serve the data is there to serve me, and in different spaces, you're going to use different things, and sometimes you're just going to use, what's available within that platform. And so I'm pretty data agnostic, and I try not to be dogmatic about, okay, this is the data set, and we're never going to stray from this data set. There's so many factors that go into deciding how I'm going to target, and what when I'm going to target, and what list I'm going to use, or if I'm going to use a list at all. And I think it really is touch and go based on a series of factors, including budget, including time, and geography. What's great about this space is there's so many different ways to slice the pie, and I don't feel constrained to a single data set at any given moment.
So how do you answer a client or a question then of what's the frequency? Like if there's so many walled gardens and you're buying across so many different platforms, how do you know how many times your audience is, how do you know it's too much with certain eyeballs or not enough?
I mean, I give separate frequencies for different platforms. So there is not a blended frequency.
Yep.
I think it's something that we're going to have to continue to address. I think it's something that, is not only an issue in our field, but also on the corporate side, right? And it's something that we're going to have to work on. I imagine, or I'm kind of curious to see the role of first-party data and how that plays into it. Like when we think about, how we're tracking with pixels and things like that, if that's going to increasingly become more and more important in the work that we do.
So when we were on our call, we talked a little bit about native data. So that's the data that is inside of just Facebook or inside of just Google. Talk to us a little bit about that and your preferences or your, any successes or failures with, just relying on the in-platform data, and what have you liked or didn't like that you saw this cycle?
Go ahead.
I mean, I'm generally pretty positive on in-platform data because when people talk about companies like Google or Facebook, generally they're talking about how well they know the users, how much information they have on them. So obviously you kind of a trust but verify. We like to think that if these companies are the ones who directly are owning and anonymizing this information, they have the most access to it. So there's a good chance that a company like Google or Facebook might know a lot more about who on their platform fits profile X, and working through their targeting tools, they make their money through advertising. So the more effective their advertising is, the more money they make as a company, the more people want to work with them. So they have every incentive to make sure that their native targeting tools are the best possible ones to utilize within their platform. Also, as a lot of these companies are less interested in having third-party data imported into them for privacy purposes and privacy concerns, so they'd rather you use their in-house targeting. And for example, bringing your outside data in, for almost any platform, you're probably using LiveRamp is kind of the almost universal tool. It's gone a lot better over the years, but your match rate often can be as low or lower than 30%. So I think people forget that across this funnel of taking your own information and eventually getting in front of a voter, there's significant drop-off every
Or it could take 2
step.
days.
What?
Your onboarding of data could take a while.
Yeah, it could take a while. It could take a week. I mean, with some of these platforms, hey, it'll take a week, and then 30% of these people will have a cookie for. And then you're just going to trust that when they actually find a cookie, that desktop cookie actually really is the desktop cookie of your person. I mean, if you actually break down the step, you have to have a lot of trust and a lot of imagination to believe that all this works. And then all of a sudden, there'll be an article in the Wall Street Journal about 75% of impressions are all fraud anyway. So you will say, okay, it's nice, and I think a lot of people who aren't in the digital space on the campaign team always use our own data, like we have the information. But if they actually thought about how much they break it down, how effective is that really? It's something we still utilize and use heavily, but if Google says they know how to find people who care about X, I tend to find that that's pretty reliable.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think, we just think about, when you think about Facebook and Google and you think about the absolute share that they have in terms of data, marketplace, ad spend, they just have a lot more data points, and they are in the business of data. So why would we not use or, continue to engage in sort of that in-platform data and build off of it? You know, one of the things I will say that we engaged in a lot of this cycle was lookalike models. And so that was very much a practice of thinking about what data sets do we have and how do we bring it into these platforms and how can they use what points that they have to make a larger universe that might be receptive to the messaging that we are looking to. And, again, I think it's, again, like a trust but verify sort of situation in all cases. And I would include Facebook and Google in that.
I mean, I agree with that all generally. I myself am a expensive data addict. I love it. I think it's awesome, and I can see in a lot of instances it gives me a strategic advantage when working with a campaign. That being said, I work with a lot of campaigns that are small dollar campaigns. They're congressional campaigns or congressional challengers, and the best data they can get a hold of is the first party data, and it's good. They're not losing anything by using that data, and I have a lot of confidence in it. Again, it's about not being dogmatic with your platforms or with the data you use, and just kind of using some common sense and strategic sense to get the best product for your client.
I'll just add real quickly is a lot of campaigns out there are very small and very lean. In fact, majority of campaigns are probably surprisingly small and lean, with the exception of a few real marquee, governor's races and Senate races, and very few marquee congressional races. Obviously, presidentials are very well staffed. It's a lot of pressure to put on every campaign out there to say, you have to have data, and just throw the word data around a lot. They don't even know what you're talking about, which who would? I mean, it's a very broad, general word, and then they need to find someone to come in and sell them something that they don't understand. And for an organization that's very lean, that doesn't necessarily have a ton of experience in this space, and doesn't have a lot of extra money to spend, if there is information, if there is targeting segments within these major platforms, including some of the major DSPs, the programmatic buying tools like those owned by Verizon or those owned by Adobe, these are companies that are investing a lot of money into making sure they have good data sets in-house. It just makes things a lot easier and a lot more efficient for a smaller campaign. When you're working at an agency or within a bigger group, you obviously are going to hold yourself to, it's like a higher standard where you really want to have all the chips on the table. But for a smaller campaign, it's almost not fair to pressure them into thinking they need to have a huge first-party data set, especially one that's a first-time.
Totally agree. My only problem with first-party data is sort of the sensibilities of the companies that are providing it. So not every data point is made available to you. So you've got to make some guesses. And when I'm working with a model or I'm working with one of the big data firms, I'm pretty much talking to at least I know I'm talking to exactly who I'm trying to reach. So you're kind of at the whim of Facebook if they want to give you, a race or gender data point. That's sometimes really important to who you're targeting.
So let's talk a little bit about transparency on the public side of what we're all doing. So you guys described a lot of behind the scenes thinking here of what you guys are doing with different data sets and how much you like having this data and what you're choosing, and you're pulling a lot of levers, and we're doing a lot of creative thinking as well as data driven thinking. And then along kind of comes these regulations, or now on Facebook we can kind of see what you're targeting. How do you deal with that as a practitioner, and how much of that is a good thing, how much of that is a bad thing? How is it, if at all, changed the way you buy?
I can jump in a little bit. I think, especially this last year, this was the cycle where a lot of changes came in from Facebook, from Google. I was mentioned by the last speaker, there's some states entirely like Nevada, and I think others, including New Jersey, where there's significant, and Maryland, where there's significant restrictions because of new laws that were passed in these states demanding certain types of transparency. The platforms just weren't prepared to provide they just technically could not provide it yet. Their platforms weren't built to. And Facebook rolled out a lot of changes that probably frustrated a lot of different people in the ad buying space around verification, et cetera. So the people who would be most opposed to this, the secrecy is gone. I think most people who are actually really evangelists for digital, like we don't want digital to be seen as some secret little toolkit which you pull out of your pocket and kind of do a surprise attack with. But you really spend your money on television, but maybe we want to do a fun little trick with digital. No one who's working digital space wants to or sees digital that way. We see it as a medium to reach the most people in the most places, the most time of day, for what's actually in front of their eyes and affecting their perspective. So I think some of the people who don't really work in digital but come from a more traditional standpoint of other platforms were really upset. How are they going to make our secrets public, even though their television buying has been public all along? I think a hope for a lot of people working in the digital space is the additional transparency helps decision makers, whether or not they have experience or come from a digital buying perspective, realize, oh wow, we need to keep up. And that horse race mentality, which really drives all the television buying, then comes to digital, and we can actually keep people accountable. When organizations and individuals say they're going to double down on digital, which everyone says every single time, but very few people do, they can be called out for it. You can't say that we're going to be innovative and using online media and not do it. And hopefully you're incentivized by what your competition's doing. I feel like I took a lot of that time. So.
Yeah, I mean, in regards to the transparency reports and regulations, I mean, I think every cycle we always go through certain frustrations and learnings with the various platforms and companies. This cycle was no exception. A lot of the things were rolled out, and I, again, have found it's been some pretty exciting things have come out of it, including the transparency report and the ways in which we can use it. And so pretty excited to see where that goes. But, one important thing for us was to always be very nimble in that regard, to understand that, to a certain extent, we are at the whim of some of these platforms. And that we have to be able to move and shift quickly when things change, like, Washington State, again, there were a couple of other states where, it's like you can no longer run ads in this state because of a recent lawsuit. And then again, speaking to sort of the regulations, with the walled gardens, there were also a number of shifts that I think Facebook and Google made this cycle in terms of first-party data and how to address it. And so I think that that's something increasingly that we're going to have to be cognizant of as we move forward.
Yeah, I agree here. I don't think it's really stopped anything that we wouldn't have done otherwise. I mean, there's some frustrations on what we could and couldn't do, but I think if anything, it just made me more creative on how I approach a race. I'm like the Velociraptor from Jurassic Park. Life finds a way. We'll figure it out. We'll get around it. We'll open those doors. And I think it caused everybody on my team just to be very cognizant that, everything we put out there at some level can be seen. And, that we don't ever want to be part of the news cycle, or at least our firm. We want to be a positive add to our clients and not a drag on their electability.
Yeah.
I feel like everyone, I know a bunch of people who spoke earlier today, everyone who's like here on these panels or talking today, we're proud of doing the stuff we do the right way. Like none of us are here to use digital as a sneaky trick. So it's exciting for people to actually see the scope of the type of creative that people are producing and the investment these organizations are putting in, because the transparency is great. It's like there'll be more spotlight on all of the work that's being done and how well it's being done.
So, speaking of kind of like your ninja abilities, one of the things that we talked about on the prep call is kind of keeping and retaining talent in this field, and the people who have the unique skill sets to do what it takes on these teams. Can each of you talk a little bit about that? Like, what do you look for in your team members? How do you keep them from cycle to cycle in a business like this? And just talk about building a digital first team.
Sure. I mean, this is a big deal for me, and it's something I've really worked hard at Push Digital. The first thing I do when I try to hire somebody, I don't look for their previous experience or skill. I'm looking for someone who just won't bullshit me. Because as long as you are telling me the truth and being straight up honest about what we're doing on a daily basis, then we can find a way and we can figure out how to navigate an election cycle. And then the second thing I would say is you've got to have people who you're willing to pay, and you've got to pay them well. So I've come from the campaign background where everybody was disposable. After election day, that person got cut and everybody was looking for a job. I don't want that. I want people who are going to stick with me cycle after cycle and learn with me. And I think we've been really good about that, and really it comes from just making sure they view this as a career, not just a single stopping point along the way.
I mean, it's talent is tough. And certainly, I think our approach, and increasingly the approach, again, is, some of the work that Priorities is doing, for example, is, getting these fellowships, getting more folks in the door, building more infrastructure, and creating space. Again, it's not just talent. We're also talking about space for digital, which, it's still a conversation that we're having. And so, as those conversations continue to grow, I think the talent will as well. I would add just, in terms of the approach to data, approach to creative, it's the same thing. It's not always someone with the most prolific background or someone with the most experience. Things change in digital so fast that you want to work with people who are able to understand that, who are able to be nimble and able to question their own assumptions. And so, yeah.
100% agree. I feel like recruiting is probably if not one of the most important roles for someone who's running a digital operation in the political space. One of the advantages of working in the political space is that the people you are working with, you can bring on the team, are actually really passionate in the success of the project, the initiative you're working on. They, ideologically, in terms of, intellectually, something they really care about personally, they are deciding to work in politics because hopefully, and for the most part, they really care about what type of people get elected to office and what types of policies those people are able to support. So I think uniquely within a political team, you have people that really care day in, day out, in a way that's really hard to find in a non-political space about all working on the same mission. That said, I think there's a lot more, the digital team's working an area with a lot more complexity than some of the other departments within a building. And so making sure that you actually have the buy-in and the partnership of other departments internally is so important for making sure that there's morale and good, a spirit de corps of the team. Because you're probably going to have to talk to lawyers a lot more because the lawyers have already figured out how TV ads work, the lawyers have figured out how direct mail works, but you're always figuring out how digital works, so it's always changing, and the lawyers definitely often don't like that. And the communications team, there's always different ways where there can either be a really great partnership or if it doesn't work out right, a lot of friction. And I think people at all levels of the digital team feel that. And the more you have good partnership and good buy-in by the building overall, the more you're going to be able to maintain and build a really good team. But it is hard to find folks. But once you do find people, I think some of the most effective political organizations are the ones that are able to build on that team cycle over cycle, because even though there's always new things coming in, a lot of the knowledge about how to operate digital within a certain organization, within a political organization, that's really hard to replicate. It's almost impossible to start from scratch. So being able to build and maintain and grow these teams cycle over cycle, the organizations that do that have really great digital operations. The ones that try to start from scratch every year or two, they're going to never move forward.
My team knows their institutional knowledge is invaluable.
Yeah.
And that on some level, while they're replaceable, they're probably not replaceable. And we all need to, as a firm, we need to reciprocate financially just to keep them around.
Definitely. No, I definitely agree with that as someone who runs an agency as well. It's just, and I agree, it's hard to start people from scratch. Bringing the cost of bringing in someone new onto a digital team is high. So it's definitely the people who stay with you, because these platforms evolve daily, weekly, and to have someone start from new all the time is difficult. I know we want to have time for questions. You want me to go one more time around with the panel, or you want to move to questions?
Let's see if we have some questions from the audience first. Were there any unusual, since Phil, you mentioned that a lot of in the last couple of cycles, we've seen a lot of new pieces of data come and fill out that voter profile. I'm curious if this cycle we saw data points that really popped out as unusual, native to this particular cycle, that were really driving voting in a different way from what you expected? Were we seeing the profile evolve so we had a deeper and different understanding of what was moving voters this cycle?
Answer is yes, and I'm not going to speak to them because some of them are really scary, but yes.
Oh, come on.
No, I mean, there are definitely things that are popping out all the time where you're like, wow, that's the greatest indicator of whether somebody's voting in a Republican primary? What's going on here? But, you know, you have those moments where you're like, where a data point pops out at you and it kind of navigates you to your messaging.
I mean, this is maybe a little less mysterious, but you know, and this is something that everyone's already heard before, but a lot of people who came out and voted in the presidential in 2016 for President Trump aren't necessarily people that were on voter files. They weren't people with a voting history. And so I think for a lot of the midterm elections this cycle, or maybe all the midterm elections this cycle, whatever side of the aisle you're on, you're trying to figure out how does the 2016 election and the turnout for the 2016 election affect the 2018 or 2017 midterms. And if you are not the president, how do those people play on a Republican ticket? If you're not the president, how do those voters who haven't voted before, who haven't voted for a governor before or a senator before, or haven't voted in a midterm before, how do they factor in because they played such a key part in the 2016 election? And I don't think anyone like fully answered that question, but trying to make sure that the models, as we were talking about earlier, factor those voters in and trying to figure out what messaging potentially resonates with those voters was something that was really top of mind for a lot of campaigns.
You know, go ahead.
I want to add, like, to a certain extent, like context and timing. It also plays a role in this, in the sense that data changes, values change, the way that people make decisions change, right, based off of the environment and what's going on too. And so that very much plays a role in, again, like how we weight and how we make our assumptions in terms of what we're using and how we're using it to talk to people.
One thing I can share that I thought was really interesting is this year, you know, all of these cord cutter models get refreshed on, you know, every 3 months, it seems like. There, you know, in Florida, statewide, I found that there were over 1 million people on our cord cutter model. And that's a staggering amount. I mean, it makes sense. I'm 36. I haven't had cable for 10 years. But that's 1 million people is a lot of folks to be talking to who are never going to see a broadcast TV ad. They're never going to see a cable ad. And we've got to find a way to talk to them. And this year I just felt like, wow, this is a segment that's big enough to spend 6 figures on a regular basis with.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm Melissa from Univision, and speaking about segmenting audiences, I wanted to know what your digital strategy is and how it changes when it comes to reaching people of color, and specifically people who don't, whose first language might not necessarily be English.
I'm happy to take a stab at this one. So this was a really great question, really valuable question. I think it's something that we talked a lot about this year and how to address that and how to go about it. And, you know, the way that we, you know, again, with the testing and sort of the spreading out of resources in terms of the data was really important to us. It was really important to us to do targeting in Spanish, to speak to people, for example, whose browser settings are set to Spanish, to use in-platform data was critically important. I mean, this is one area where, you know, where we know that the voter file is on occasion lacking when we talk about youth, when we talk about communities of color and sort of mobile voters. And so again, it's very important when we think about our approach to data and our approach to targeting to think about the universe that we want to talk to and then move from there. It's not always built from the voter file, it's who are we talking to and what is the best way to talk to them, the best data set to be able to find that person.
You know, one of the things I've really been thinking about and implementing is making sure that when we do Spanish language advertising, that we take into consideration the background nationality of those individuals and segment out not just Spanish language, but if we're doing stuff in Florida, that all of the different nationalities represented are getting marketing that's speaking to them in their own dialect and in their own way. And that's not even saying we're changing the message around, but that's just saying different groups receive messages in different ways, and we want to be cognizant of that as we target.
I think something that's exciting from the digital standpoint is that African American and Hispanic voters, they over-index for use of digital platforms, use of social media, and mobile. So I think it's something that, as kind of the digital voice in the room during budgeting decisions and trying to determine where we allocate our resources, it's something that we just try to stay aware of and evangelize to the organization in general that working with the digital team and having really a digital-first strategy is often perhaps the more effective ways to reach these kind of audiences.
Sue?